Okay, so get this. Jesus, born in Asia, died in Asia, right? But early Christianity, not just some westward thing.
Right.
His first followers, they were spreading the word like eastward from West Asia,
Right.
like even at Pentecost, you know? The Bible talks about pilgrims from, well, we'd say Iran, Iraq, Turkey today.
That's fascinating.
It really makes you think about like where Christianity actually comes from.
Totally different perspective, yeah.
It's this whole story of Christianity in Asia. It's super interesting and often like surprising, and we're going to dig into it through 5 key periods.
5 key periods.
Yeah, 5 periods of like growth and change. We're using this book, Asian Christianity by Scott Sundquist, to guide us.
Oh, I've heard of that book. It's supposed to be excellent.
It's amazing. And, you know, he's a professor of world mission and evangelism. So, like,
He knows his stuff.
he really knows his stuff. So our mission today, right, is to pull out those like most important insights
Right.
from his work about how Christianity like spread across Asia throughout history.
A big topic.
Huge topic. But we're giving you the shortcut, right? The cheat sheet to understanding this huge and kind of surprising story. So
I like it. A cheat sheet to history. But also it's, so important to understand this history of Christianity in Asia, like for the bigger picture, right?
Right.
It helps us appreciate the global diversity of Christianity and how it's interacted with different cultures, different religions over the centuries.
absolutely. It's not just like a Western story.
Exactly. It's a much more complex and nuanced story.
So, okay. Sundquist lays out these 5 periods. He calls them advances.
Advances. Right.
And they're defined by the main groups involved, right? And what really struck me was, he says, the first and the last of these advances, like the very earliest and the most recent, those were the most effective
Interesting. Why?
because they were driven by Asian-led missionary work.
Oh, or
He also says the Western missionary efforts in between, those were like super important too because they laid the groundwork.
oh, I see. So each period built on the one before it.
Yeah, like a relay race across centuries.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
And it shows us that, cultural affinity and really understanding the local context, those are crucial for a religion to really take root and spread.
Right.
And it's a lesson that, frankly, later Western missions often had to learn the hard way.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. The Persian advance. This was like through the first millennium,
Or
AD.
the first 1,000 years.
So what were the key things about this early spread of Christianity?
Well, what's really interesting here is how the Christian message moved.
Right.
It moved along these existing trade routes.
Oh, yeah, like the Silk Road.
The Silk Road, exactly, on land, and also the sea routes, too. So it wasn't like some top-down imposition. It was more organic. It followed the flow of, commerce and cultural exchange.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and we see this pattern over and over again in history, right? New ideas often spread along the same paths as trade and cultural exchange.
Totally. So what happened? Where did it go first?
Well, we see these early Christian communities popping up along the southern coastlines of India.
Coastlines? Okay.
First in the southeast and then the southwest. And tradition, which Sundquist actually considers pretty reliable in this case, attributes this to the Apostle Thomas himself.
The Apostle Thomas.
Yeah. And the tradition even says he was martyred in India.
Wow, the Apostle Thomas in India. That's early.
It is. Really early.
But the source mentions like limited growth, due to Hindu reaction and the caste system.
Right. Those are major barriers.
It sounds like those early Christians, they faced like some really tough social and cultural
Obstacles.
obstacles, exactly.
You've got these existing social structures, these religious beliefs that were very, very different from Christianity.
Right.
And the caste system in particular, it created these deep divisions within society.
Yeah.
Made conversion really challenging.
It's amazing that any of them survived at all.
Oh, it is. It really shows their resilience,
Yeah.
Despite facing persecution, they found ways to hold on to their faith.
And they were speaking Syriac, right?
Yes, Syriac. It's a dialect of Aramaic,
Which,
the language that Jesus himself would have spoken.
wow. That's a pretty powerful connection to,
Absolutely. And Syriac was also the common language for trade in that region, so it makes sense that Christianity would spread along those same lines.
Right.
Kind of like how English is used in international business today,
Yeah. It's the lingua franca.
Exactly.
So many of these early missionaries, they were actually Jewish traders.
Right. Tent makers like Paul.
Yeah, combining faith and commerce.
Exactly.
And then there's a whole geopolitical context, right? Persia, they were the big rivals of the Roman Empire.
Huge rivals.
So that meant the Asian church, it developed kind of independently.
Right. They weren't getting constant updates from Rome.
Exactly. They even held their own church councils.
It's fascinating how they developed their own traditions and interpretations.
And the source mentions monastic schools in Persia, like
Yeah.
places like Nisibis and Mosul. What was their role?
Those were important centers of learning and, theological development. They really helped to foster a unique Asian Christian identity.
Asian Christian identity.
Yeah, distinct from what was happening in the West.
So a lot of early converts, they were coming from Zoroastrianism.
Right, and that influenced their theology.
In what way?
Well, they tended to focus on themes like ritual purity, the cosmic battle between good and evil.
Like the idea that there's this constant struggle between like these opposing forces.
Exactly, and God is the ultimate creator.
So these Persian Christians, they weren't just like holding on to their faith.
They were spreading it.
Yeah, they were actively spreading it. The source calls them zealous missionaries. They reached like all across Central Asia and even as far as China.
Imagine that. Traveling all that way to spread your faith.
It's incredible. And then you have the arrival of the Persian monk, Elopin, in Xi'an. That was the capital of the Tang dynasty.
Yeah, in 635 AD. That was a pivotal moment.
Why?
Well, the Tang dynasty was relatively new, and they were very open to outside influences.
More open than later dynasties, maybe?
Definitely. So it was the perfect time for Christianity to gain a foothold.
And there's that amazing Nestorian monument.
Oh, yeah. That's an incredible piece of history.
It's huge, 10 feet tall.
And it basically announces the arrival of Christianity in China. It talks about how monasteries and churches were built and how, at least initially, Christianity was really well received.
It's like a historical billboard, you know?
I love that. A historical billboard. It's like they were saying, hey, world, we're here.
Exactly. But then, as so often happens, things changed.
Things always changed.
The Tang dynasty declined.
And that led to a backlash against foreign religions, including Christianity.
It's interesting, though, like Buddhism, it managed to adapt and it found a lasting place in China.
Right, it did.
But Christianity faced severe persecution and was basically forgotten in the West.
It makes you wonder, why? What were the different factors at play?
Maybe Buddhism was just more flexible.
That's possible. The way it blends with other beliefs, it may have been easier for it to integrate with existing Chinese philosophies.
That makes sense. So, despite all the persecution, Christianity did survive in the region.
It did.
But they were still worshiping in Syriac, even though...
Most people didn't even understand it anymore.
It's fascinating how, even when a language dies out, it can still, be preserved in religious rituals.
It's a testament to the power of tradition.
Yeah. And then back in Persia, there was the Arab Muslim conquest around 650.
Another turning point.
Initially, Christians had some freedom, but then all these restrictions started coming in.
Right. They couldn't build or repair churches as easily.
They couldn't evangelize freely.
And they couldn't marry outside their community.
Wow. So that pretty much put an end to that first big push eastward, right?
It did. It significantly limited the spread of Christianity from Persia.
Okay, so that was the first advance. Now, the second one, it's called the Franciscan-Mongol Interlude.
The Franciscan-Mongol Interlude.
That sounds kind of dramatic.
It was. This was from 1206 to 1368. So we're talking about the Mongol conquest of China.
Right.
And the Mongols, they were actually pretty tolerant when it came to religion.
Okay.
Leaders like Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan, they'd conquered this vast territory, with all these different cultures.
Oh, it's a huge empire.
And that created this brief window of opportunity for European missions.
And the source talks about Pope Innocent V sending John of Carpini to the Mongols.
In 1246.
But it sounds like it was more about politics than, actual evangelism.
Yeah, there was definitely a political agenda there.
The Pope basically told the Khan to convert and submit to his authority.
Not exactly a recipe for successful interfaith dialogue.
No. And the Khan, Guk Khan, he responded by demanding tribute from the Pope and all the European kings.
He basically said, yeah, you first.
It shows you how little they understood each other.
And the power dynamics at play.
And then there's the whole Marco Polo thing, right?
Oh, yeah.
When he returned to Europe in 1271, he brought back this request from Kublai Khan.
Kublai Khan wanted 100 teachers to come to China and teach the Mongols about Christianity.
100 teachers. Can you imagine that opportunity?
Incredible, right?
But apparently the Pope was too busy with wars and stuff in Europe to respond.
It was a huge missed opportunity. Who knows what could have happened?
Yeah, it's really mind-boggling.
It shows how limited their worldview was at the time. They were so focused on Europe that they missed this huge potential opening in Asia.
It wasn't until 1294 that John of Monte Corvino finally arrived in Khanbaliq, which is now Beijing.
But by then, Kublai Khan had already died.
It seems like they were always a step behind.
Yeah, it's almost tragic.
But Monte Corvino, he did have some success, right?
He did. He worked there for 34 years. He got support from the imperial court. He built churches, and he even baptized Mongols.
That's pretty impressive considering.
It is. It shows that when there was dedicated effort, Christianity could make inroads.
But the Mongol Empire was, well, it was a foreign entity, and it eventually declined in the mid-14th century.
Right. And when that happened, those small Catholic communities, they pretty much disappeared.
They didn't have deep roots in Chinese society,
Yes.
exactly.
They were dependent on the Mongol rulers for support. And when that support went away, they were vulnerable.
It's a good lesson, you know. For any movement, religious or otherwise, you need to build deep roots, connect with the local culture if you want to last.
Absolutely.
So a promising but ultimately short-lived advance. Now we come to the 16th century and the Jesuit advance.
From 1542 to 1773.
This was the age of, like, European exploration, right?
Exactly. You've got Portuguese and Spanish explorers sailing all over the world.
And they were bringing Christianity with them.
With a papal mandate to Christianize all these new lands they were discovering.
It's a whole different era.
It is. And the Jesuits, they were at the forefront of this missionary effort.
And they seemed to take a different approach than those earlier missionaries.
Yeah, they were really focused on learning local languages and immersing themselves in local cultures.
Which makes sense, right? If you want to communicate with people, you have to speak their language.
Exactly. And they believed that understanding and respecting local customs was essential for spreading the Christian message.
And this helped them build more lasting churches.
It did. Even in the face of persecution, these communities were often able to survive because they were more deeply rooted in their local cultures.
But it also caused some controversy, right?
Oh yeah, big time. Some people felt like they were adapting too much, that they were compromising essential Christian doctrines.
Like walking a fine line.
Totally. It was a balancing act between being culturally sensitive and maintaining theological orthodoxy.
The source gives a couple of examples, right? Like Matteo Ricci in China.
He insisted on using a local name for God.
And he interpreted ancestor tablets in a way that fit with Chinese culture, but that didn't go over well with everyone back in Europe.
Some people felt like he was watering down the faith.
Then there's Roberto de Nobili in India. He presented himself as a sannyasi, an Indian holy man.
To try to reach both lower and upper castes.
But that caused conflict within the church, too. It's really fascinating to see how they were trying to navigate these cultural differences.
It was uncharted territory in a lot of ways. They were trying to figure out how to translate the Christian message into completely different worldviews.
And it raises some tough questions, you know, like how far can you adapt? Where do you draw the line?
Right. When does contextualization become syncretism? It's an ongoing debate in missions even today.
Another example is Alexandre de Rhodes in Vietnam. He adapted his catechism to address questions from Confucianists, Buddhists, and Taoists. It's interesting how these different religions were all kind of intertwined in Vietnam.
Yeah, they called it Tam Shido, the triple religion.
Triple religion.
And Rhodes was really focused on understanding that Tam Shido worldview.
And empowering local leaders.
He believed that the Vietnamese people needed to own their faith, that it couldn't just be imposed from outside.
So despite all these efforts, the Jesuits and the communities they built still faced persecution.
Yeah, it was a dangerous time to be a Christian in many parts of Asia.
In Japan, China, Vietnam, even India.
But the fact that many of these communities survived, often under local leadership, it really speaks to the groundwork that the Jesuits laid.
Even if their methods were controversial, they had a lasting impact.
Absolutely. They showed that Christianity could take root in Asia if it was willing to engage with local cultures on their own terms.
Okay, now we move on to the Protestant advance. This starts in 1706.
With the arrival of those Danish-German missionaries in India.
And their initial growth was slower than the Catholic missions, right?
It was. They faced a lot of challenges.
So what were some of the key differences in their approach?
Well, for one thing, the Protestants often found themselves at odds with the Dutch and British East India companies.
Oh, right, because those companies were all about trade, and sometimes they saw the missionaries as, like, competition.
Exactly. Plus, the Protestants had a different focus.
In what way?
They put a huge emphasis on translating the entire Bible into local languages.
The whole Bible.
The whole thing. It was a massive undertaking.
That must have been incredibly impactful.
It was. It allowed people to engage with the scriptures directly in their own languages.
And it led to the development of written forms for many of those languages.
Yeah, they had to create writing systems in some cases.
Wow. They also had a strong emphasis on education, right?
Absolutely. They believed that education was key to spreading the gospel.
And they set up schools.
They did.
Yeah.
And they also laid the groundwork for many modern universities in Asia.
So their impact went beyond just religious conversion.
Definitely. They had a huge influence on the development of education in Asia.
But the source also mentions that they brought a lot of Western cultural baggage with them.
It's true. They often saw Western culture as superior, and they tried to impose those values along with their religious teachings.
Which, looking back, is kind of problematic.
Yeah, it was a very colonial mindset.
But it's important to remember, most of the spread of Christianity during this period was actually done by Asians themselves.
That's a crucial point. It wasn't just Westerners coming in and converting people.
Asian Christians were taking ownership of their faith and spreading it within their own communities.
And they were developing their own forms of Christianity, drawing on their own cultural traditions.
Like those early Korean converts who converted just by reading the translated Gospels.
That's an amazing story. They were so hungry for the truth that they sought out baptism on their own initiative.
It shows the power of the word, right?
Absolutely.
And there were also all these tensions within the Protestant missions themselves, right?
Oh, yeah. They were constantly debating the best way to do missions.
Like, some thought it was important to teach Western knowledge and culture.
While others thought they should focus solely on the Bible.
And there were different ideas about higher education versus what they called the three self principles.
Right. Self-support, self-governance, self-propagation.
Which basically meant that local churches should be independent and run their own affairs.
It was a reaction against the colonial model of missions, where Westerners were often in control.
It's interesting how these different approaches reflected different philosophies of mission.
It shows that there was no one right way to do missions.
And it's also interesting that the Protestants often had the most success among like poorer tribal groups and marginalized communities.
Like the Dalits in India.
It's like they were drawn to the message of equality and liberation that Christianity offered.
And they weren't as tied to the existing power structures that often resisted conversion.
Right, they were more open to new ideas.
And after the Pacific War, as colonies started gaining independence, there was a huge surge in church growth.
And more Asian leadership.
As Western dominance declined, Asian Christians stepped up to take on leadership roles.
It was a real turning point, which leads us to the fifth and final advance, the Asian indigenous advance.
This is where we see Christianity really taking off in Asia, driven by Asian Christians themselves.
It's amazing, right? After centuries of Western missionary efforts, it's now the Asians who are leading the way.
Exactly. It's like the baton has been passed.
And it's happening all over Asia.
In some regions with strong national religions, like, say, Iraq or Iran.
Or Thailand, Bangladesh.
Right. Those places have seen slower growth.
Or even decline.
But in most other parts of Asia, Christianity is booming.
And it's thanks to the efforts of Asian missionaries.
Like in India, there are over 20,000 Indian missionaries working all over the country.
20,000, wow.
It's incredible. And Christianity is thriving in Nepal, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos.
And that's largely due to missionaries from other Asian countries, right?
Exactly. From India, Korea, Malaysia, Taiwan, China, Singapore. They're going everywhere.
And they're using all sorts of creative ways to spread the gospel.
Like planting churches while working in trade or manufacturing.
It's like they're weaving their faith into the fabric of everyday life.
They're meeting people where they are.
It's so inspiring to see.
And the results are undeniable.
Like in South Korea, nearly a third of the population is Christian now.
Since the partition from the north.
It's remarkable.
And then there's China.
China, that's the big one, right?
It is. They've gone from about 2 million Christians in 1950 to over 60 million today.
That's just mind-blowing.
It's one of the most significant periods of Christian growth in history.
And it's mostly due to the efforts of Chinese Christians themselves.
They're taking ownership of their faith and spreading it like wildfire.
And then there's the Back to Jerusalem movement.
Oh, yeah, that's a powerful movement.
It's these Chinese Christians who are committed to, like, taking the gospel back to the West.
It's like they're completing the circle, you know?
Right. From the margins of West Asia to East Asia and now back to the West.
It's a beautiful picture of how God works.
It really is. So, to sum up, we've seen these 5 major advances in the history of Christianity in Asia.
Starting with the Persian expansion along those ancient trade routes,
Then the brief but fascinating Franciscan-Mongol interlude.
followed by the Jesuit missions, with their focus on cultural engagement.
And the Protestant advance, with their emphasis on the Bible and education.
And finally, the Asian indigenous advance, where we see Asian Christians taking the lead.
It's a story of resilience, adaptation, and the constant interaction between faith and culture.
It's also a story of how Christianity has encountered and been shaped by some of the world's major religions.
Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism.
It's given Christianity in Asia a unique flavor, a richness and diversity that we don't always see in other parts of the world.
And it makes you think, what does this history tell us about the future of Christianity?
Exactly. As Asia continues to rise in global influence, what role will Asian Christians play in shaping the future of the faith?
What will global Christianity look like in 100 years?
That's a question for you, the listener, to ponder,
To really think about.
because the story of Christianity in Asia is far from over,
In fact, it's just beginning.
and the future is wide open.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.